All right. So I got a question. I get this question a lot. A lot of people ask this question. A lot of people don't understand it. A lot of people in the mental health field don't really understand it. And it centers around trauma and like, how does trauma work? How does it work in the brain? Trauma is in our culture. There's a lot of it. And most of the time when we think about it, we think about like PTSD. We think about, soldiers going off to war. We think about rape. We think about severe experiences that have overwhelmed the person to the point of where they get stuck in it. And so, something happens and they're triggered and they go back into it. What we don't really understand as a culture, but we do neurologically speaking, is that trauma is much bigger than that. Trauma is emotional abandonment. Trauma is growing up in a home where your emotions are invalidated and you're told to be strong. You got to be tough. Trauma is generational. Trauma gets passed down genetically in a way through what's called epigenetics. Trauma stops you from being able to be fully present, to think clearly, because the way that your brain is designed is that there's a part of your brain. So you have your outside of your brain, which, let's say this is your your right and left hemisphere, and it wraps over your amygdala. Your amygdala is your fight, flight, freeze, fold function. And there's more to this, like with the limbic system and how it floods your body with these feelings and creates stress. But your amygdala is basically where the fight, flight, freeze, fold reaction is. So when you're a baby, you're primarily functioning from this amygdala, which evolutionary biologists call it the reptilian brain. Whether you are a creationist or a evolutionist, the purpose of this is for you to survive, to put you in a situation where you don't have to think, but you can react to protect yourself. That's the purpose of the amygdala. It shuts down your prefrontal cortex where the logic is, and it allows your brain to just respond as quickly as possible without logically thinking. Like you're a pitcher, you pitch the ball flies at you, you catch it. And you didn't think about it like, wow, that's incredible. That's your amygdala. Also, it's the exact same thing as you grow up in a home where conflict is totally avoided, or conflict is really toxic. Someone comes up to you and says, hey, it hurt me when you did this. Your brain, your amygdala, hears that and you feel under attack. And so you either you avoid it, you just agree with whatever the person's saying, or you go on the attack, you go to fight, and you want to shut the person down because you're not going to let anybody treat you that way. And you think that they're abusing you because it's triggering you. And you can't think clearly, but you see it that way. It gives you that lens to look through. So to understand what's going on with like most people in our culture, it's really important to look at how the amygdala affects your thought process. In our culture for a long time, and especially in my field, there's been this idea that your thoughts control your feelings. And that's true to an extent, except for when there's something registered as trauma in the brain. This is really important. When your amygdala is, when you're little and you're a baby and you're crying and you don't understand what's going on, you don't think logically before you're 3 years old, your prefrontal cortex is barely even starting to develop, and you're cold, you're just cold, so you're screaming. Your mom picks you up, she doesn't try to reason with you because she knows that that's not going to soothe you. Instead, her warmth, her eye contact, her tone of voice, all of these things communicate to the amygdala, you're not alone in this experience, it's going to be okay. The mother contains the stress, and that allows you, through mirror neurons, to also begin to contain the stress. But something happens when children become about 3 years old. For instance, they start to, like, the twos of terrible twos, 4 years old, they start to hide in the clothes rack in the mall. They start to express their independence. Their brain, their prefrontal cortex, their logical side is starting to develop, and they're starting to think for themselves. They're realizing that they're separate, and they start challenging these things. And how a parent responds to that directly relates to how their parents responded to them in the lessons that they learned. And these lessons that they want to pass on to their children might be well-intentioned, but they're not always the best for the child. This idea is really present in our culture, is this idea that the world is cold, no one's going to look out for you, you've got to look out for yourself, and to survive, you've got to be strong, you can't be weak. So the child falls down, scrapes his knees, screaming. Some parents might go up to you like, you got to rub some dirt on, you got to be strong, like da, da, da. You know, basically you're invalidating the emotional experience of it because you don't want the child to be weak, and you're telling them they're alone in that experience, that for them to be strong, they have to push that aside. And that might be very much what you learned in your childhood. And from that experience, that lens that you have experienced recreations of that dynamic throughout your life. And it seems true. And anyone who doesn't do that triggers a part of you, because that part of you, that need of needing to be emotionally vulnerable, of being able to have weaknesses, it's a part you hate. You have to be good, and to be worthy, you can't have any of that because you have to be strong and you have to survive. So you push that down. And if someone else has it, you hate that part of yourself, so you can project that onto another person. And a lot of times you'll attract somebody as opposite of that, you know, in like a relationship or whatever, but you'll resent each other. Anyways, that's a whole nother conversation into codependency. But for the child needs to know that, just like the baby needs to know that they're not alone. And the initial response, the rejection that I usually get from this from people, is more people who are primary anxiety, who learned what I just had explained about their performance and having to be strong. And they have to constantly be great to be enough. They have to constantly be in control to be enough. And they don't want their children to be weak. And so they automatically balk at this idea about coddling, or it's like a pendulum, like swinging from one side or the other, because you can be a helicopter mom and you can literally make the child, or a helicopter dad, you can make the child feel completely stuck in dependency, where they're constantly depending upon a parent for validation. But one thing is different. The validation that I'm talking about versus the validation that our culture does, that creates that kind of person, is the difference between an intellectual validation and an emotional empathy, which is a different form of validation. So before, I guess I'm gonna have to get into codependency, but before I go there, I want to make this clear also, is that when your amygdala is soothed, just like the baby is being soothed, and when your amygdala is being soothed as you're older, it actually creates connections between itself and the prefrontal cortex, which allow it to process traumatic experiences or stressors much more efficiently and being resilient. And so when someone else, if you grew up in a home where your mother is emotionally empathetic, it's called attunement. If she's doing that, which is very rare these days, or your father is doing that, you internalize your self-worth as my needs matter, therefore I matter. And what happens physically in the brain is it makes those connections to the prefrontal cortex, and it allows your brain to actually develop more. And so there's a lot of intellectual development issues that happen along with being raised in a home that is not emotionally attuning. And so when these people experience stress, they're less likely to experience PTSD or trauma, because they have the resiliency that is actually built off of that self-worth and the connections between their brain that allows them to filter these experiences through that security. If you don't have that, it's all about, I don't have my emotional needs met, therefore I have to have behaviors that make me matter, a performance, or that's primary anxiety, or I'm never enough, which is depression. No matter how hard I try, I'm never enough. And I might need substances to alleviate those things. Like, you know, maybe an alcoholic is a anxiety-driven person and they're constantly trying to perform. And the moment that they slow down, they feel like they're not going to be enough. And so they have to drink to justify their ability to relax. So they use these substances. And all these things, it's like nature and nurture combined together. It isn't one or the other. So the environment triggers epigenetics, because you can have a predisposition based off of your family experiences. They actually get passed down, and with genetic information, give a predisposition towards a type of adaptation, if you will, to an environmental experience. And I'm not talking about species change. I'm just talking about your being predisposed towards violence or towards weight gain, because your mother, while she was pregnant, she struggled with like famine in her area. So, you know, that gets passed down genetically. It can happen, you know, before that as well, epigenetically, and you have a predisposition to constantly gain weight because the environment that you're being told that you're developing in is this kind of environment. And then the environment reinforces it, and it gets passed down. And it can get passed down, it can get into the line, the genetic line, and even like a third generation can experience something even when that's gone. It doesn't have to be turned on. A person who is predisposed towards violent, like more violent tendencies, they could be the most peaceful people ever, and they will stay that way as long as the environment doesn't trigger them into that corner and then he's hijacked. So you've got your amygdala, you've got your free will, which is hard to focus on when your amygdala shuts it down. That's what it's designed for. And if the stressor is too big for you and you don't have the coping tools and the healthy experience of trauma resolve that has happened in your life, the soothing that's happened in your life, then you are more likely to be overwhelmed and be triggered and then relapse, whether it's substances or behaviors. So most forms of therapy in my field are centered around symptom reduction and treating the symptoms. And which dog do you feed? You know, there's a lot of great types of therapy that really benefit our culture and the people that are going to therapy, because you're learning how to cope with these symptoms. But the medical model that we have is a lot about treating symptoms because we haven't really known how to treat the underlying issue. But now we do. A lot of the research now, neurological research, is showing how the brain works. And you can actually see this under brain scans when people are going through these types of therapy, and they're not the cognitive types of therapy. A lot of people have heard of EMDR, for instance. And to understand how EMDR works, you have to understand how the amygdala works and how the brain works. So if you, like, just a recap on like what EMDR is, if you're not familiar with what I'm talking about, you go to the therapist, you have some trauma, you were in Iraq and you experience a really traumatic event with an IED or your mate, and you saw that person experience, like, go through this thing, and you're right there, and it's overwhelming. You don't have the capacity to really be present when those things happen. So whenever a firecracker goes off, the amygdala pulls you back in time. It's the same reason why you and I could be talking about something and I could confront you about something and it triggers a memory for you from your childhood, where it pulls you back in time and you're feeling things like you're under attack, you're not enough, and you react. But reality, I'm just trying to get closer to you. I'm trying to pull this wall that's between us, or whatever that is. Your amygdala is telling you that there's a threat and it's pulling you back in time because time doesn't exist for the amygdala. So EMDR is it's really cool because the lady that developed it, she was looking at, like, thinking about brain, like how the brain works when you're asleep. And so, like, you know, when your eyes are darting around and you're processing things emotionally in your memories and you're storing that information. It's why, like, you feel certain things like your teeth are crumbling because of anxiety, you feel like out of control, and your dreams process this in a visual way. It's going back and forth and you're storing all that in your brain, right? Well, as you're doing this, you're basically using what's called bilateral integration. You're processing the different parts of your brain. And she thought maybe we could reverse engineer that. We could hack that. So EMDR, it's like you have different stimuluses which are happening, whether it's like a visual thing, you're looking back and forth, a light going back and forth, or you're being touched back and forth. What that does is it's keeping your logical brain stuck in the present moment because you're having to visually go back and forth and see, experience tactily, you're experiencing these things, and it's keeping you physically grounded to a degree while the therapist is walking you through an emotional experience. And you're getting the experience of not being alone in that while being grounded, because your amygdala is not able to fully hijack your brain and bring you completely out of that. And that allows them to become a resolve because the amygdala gets opened back up in a safe environment where it's not alone. And then the therapist helps skillfully navigate you to a different resolve. And that resolves the underlying trauma. That's the purpose of that. And that's great. And that for that specific thing. But we can do that in therapy without this as well. And this is kind of what I'm building up to. And so when a client comes in, and let's say they are struggling with something as complex as narcissism. From a cognitive approach, they say there's no resolve for narcissism. But from what's called a psychodynamic approach, there is a lot of evidence to support that narcissism can be resolved because you're not treating the symptoms. If my worst fear is not being enough, and I literally grew up in a home where my parents constantly criticize me. They constantly beat me down. They constantly are telling me, no matter how hard I try, I'm never going to be enough, and that everything is wrong. that part of me, that bad part of me where I feel all bad and worthless, I'm gonna do everything I can to not feel that way, because that's stored, that's ingrained into my psyche, my amygdala. That's big trauma. And so I have to be all good all the time. And I need to convince everyone of these things. I need to constantly stay here, because the moment I mess up, I'm triggered. My amygdala pulls me back and I'm worthless. So a narcissist is functioning from that. And it doesn't even have to be this constant berate of criticism. It can be a family or a parent that doesn't do criticism. All they do is positively affirm you. And so you're never getting the truth. And it's not so much that you're just hearing positive things all about yourself, but you're scared. You don't learn how to handle criticism. So you have to camp in the all good, and you have to feel this pressure to constantly be all good, because your parent constantly performs, I mean, constantly says that you're great. Like, no, they can't ever deal with that. They're not able to contain your weaknesses and your failures. So neither can you. You didn't internalize that. So you have to camp in the all good. And to go back to what we were saying before, like, you don't want to coddle somebody. And if you go in there and if a narcissistic client comes into the office and they're like, everybody's jealous of me, everybody, and you like, you can know, like, you can catch on, okay, this person probably has some narcissistic traits. We all do to some degree, because we all grew up in homes where they weren't perfect. That's humanity. But if, and then instead we focus on the emotional experience. This is called empathetic attunement. We don't keep the person logic. We don't keep them in the content. We keep them in the process. So instead, like, no matter how we try, we're never recognized for what we're worth. And if that's what they hear and that's what they feel, they make eye contact with you, they're like, yeah, and da da da. But a narcissist, they have a lot of walls up. So if you start to cognitively point out what their issues are, to try to contrast it and see yada yada yada, you're triggering their need to be enough, and that they're making mistakes and they can't go there. So it's very hard. It's like butting heads, and it's working against the brain's natural design to protect itself. It's adapted to do that. It's this way with depression, anxiety, across the board, with personality disorders and mood disorders. And what we want to happen is we want the person's protective states that are there. They're called ego states. We want to ally with them emotionally, not validate their actions, but validate the emotional need behind it. Just like a mother soothing a baby who's overwhelmed, these people are being overwhelmed, just like a person that's depressed is with suicide ideation, which you have to be careful with suicide ideation, because you can trigger somebody. So leave that to the professionals. What we want to do is we want to get into that experience, like the depression. No matter how to try, it's not enough. It's like, I go outside, I do these things, but I feel blah, blah, blah. Like and so I put on the show and I pretend, and then I can't maintain it. It's like a tree that doesn't have the nutrients, and everyone's telling you to look like this. You've got to have a job. You got to go outside. You got to do this. You got to do this. But you got to get out of bed and all these things. And you try that and you try that. But no matter what, you feel dead inside. And it's like, it's not there. You're emotionally isolated. And what you need is someone to come sit with you in that trench, in that pit of mess, and be present with you the entire time as you talk about it, and whatever ego states you have there, protecting that, and be present and just empathize with you and describe what it's like for the other person. Like, you don't say, you probably feel, because the moment you say that, you're saying, I'm separate from you. But because of empathy and mirror neurons, we know what it feels like to feel alone. We know what it feels like to feel like we don't measure up. We know what it feels like. So we can simply speak from those places and recognize, hey, no matter how I try, it's never enough. And you put voice to that, and they're like, yes, exactly. And what that does over time, if you allow them to go through their defenses, their ego defenses, you ally with that, then they no longer need those ego defenses. And then you can get to the vulnerability, because now they're feeling heard and seen emotionally, possibly for the first time in their life. And they're not being judged. You're not giving them a solution. You're just being present with them. And what that does physically in the brain, it allows the amygdala to start to calm down. It allows the amygdala to start making connections between that and the prefrontal cortex to logically resolve the underlying trauma that's there. And it creates this window, which is really interesting. Daniel Siegel calls this memory consolidation. And what's really cool about this is that when the person's starting to internalize, I matter because my feelings matter, you keep hearing this person be present with you, and you start to feel what it feels like to have your feelings matter. And it's incredible. It's scary if you've never had it, Your walls want to go up. And so they validate those. And it's like, and you go back and forth until eventually there's this moment, this window that happens. And in that moment, the person draws closer to you, gives you the opposite experience of what you learned the moment you experienced your trauma. If it's shame that you have, the opposite of that is what most people think it's pride, interestingly, but it's acceptance. You're accepted by the other person. You're still loved. Your value isn't about your performance. And so they draw closer to you. Like, I also, they may say, I also, I feel a lot safer with you now you say that, because I blah, blah, blah. I've done this. I've experienced this. I did this. And, and that person's not alone. Or it's like, wow, you really have a lot of courage for saying that. I want the same courage for doing that. You validate what they've done, and what that does is it's a positive experience to what was a trauma at the right time, the right place, when they feel vulnerable, and it can reconsolidate that experience, resolve that trauma, and then there's no more need to cope anymore. This is really important for our culture, because the majority of us, from like just a family dynamic, from the micro individuals, to a political spectrum, to why people see things this way and why they push for policies that are like this. They don't have time for people who are needy. You need to work. I did this, I achieved this. Or the people that are like, I'm just going to take advantage of the government because no one ever looked out for me. So I'm going to take what I can. All of these things come from these experiences that we have in our childhood. And that doesn't mean our parents are worthless. And a lot of us want to protect and idealize our parents. But in reality is they're human, and we've been learning things generationally for a long time, and trauma has been embedded into our culture. And if we are successful financially, if we're successful outwardly, then it's easy for us to say this is the right way. When you look at really highly successful people, when you look at people who are like, well, you have to do this, and you got to make your bed every morning, and you got to do this, and you will be a millionaire if you do this, and everybody can do it if they just work hard enough, and the stress constantly trying to go. And you listen to their story. Their parents were alcoholics. Their parents were abusive. Their parents are divorced. They've been themselves through divorces, and it's all about this anxiety, and the culture rewards that. So it seems like it's a really good thing. And when you grow up in a culture like that, there's going to be a pendulum swing. And we're seeing that, and we see these generational gaps that happen where there's this resistance, and it plays out with like I mentioned before, with how your political ideology, you can end up being in any political party based off of these experiences, whereas someone who's really healthy will see things a lot differently. And it happens in faith, in your religion. It plays out in that, and it plays out the type. And when like I'm a Christian, so when I read about grace, and when I read about what, like, how to handle repentance, and the fact that I fall short, and I'm not a perfect person. And so, like, if my narrative is I have to work hard to be enough, and to earn my parents' approval, and to be good enough because they didn't know how to emotionally validate me, and they're trying to make me strong, I'm going to translate that to my relationship with my faith and my God in that case. And I'm going to constantly see things. I might logically understand grace, and I might read, that grace, grace is enough, that we were loved before, but I still translate that emotionally into these goals where I'm constantly doing. And that plays into how we play out our faith and the type of church, whether they're all grace or all truth, judgmental, or they're just, too lenient. But love is about truth and grace. So anyhow, before I digress too much with that, going back to trauma, this is really important. This is a really key issue, and what I'm trying to build a documentary on, to kind of show these things and how this works with some visuals and some science behind it. And I want you to understand, whether you're a clinician or whether you're somebody else, that these struggles, where they're coming from, how they can be healed, and how you communicate with each other in such a way that invites connection, that leads to my feelings matter, that leads to healing, and so that we can start changing the world. Because it doesn't happen through control. It doesn't happen from the top. It's from the bottom up. It's all through relationship. We are a communal species, and the same way that we get hurt is the same way we get healed, and it's through relationship. And that's what's so important. If you have any questions, I would be totally excited to answer those things. If there's anything I missed, I can make another video. I hope that you like and subscribe. I'm a therapist and I work at Encompass Counseling in San Juan Capistrano. You can look me up. But I hope that you enjoyed this. I hope this was informative, and let me know what you think. Thank you.